Hello and welcome to the New Books Network. I'm Pierre. Art School. Since art schools are now typically incorporated into universities, it is no longer the norm for them to have mottos imprinted on the crests or logos. If one were to devise a headline for today's art school, the choice between "You too can be an artist" and "Abandon all hope, you who enter here" would be quite tough. Despite significant changes in mainstream art education in recent decades, many anglophone art schools have not abandoned the principal tools of the masterclass or the crit that stem from some stubborn 18th century inventions. Considering these histories can shed light on the role of the art school in the 21st century. A Philosophy of the Art School by Michael Newall does just that. The book draws on first-hand accounts of art school teaching and is deeply informed by disciplines ranging from art history and art theory to the philosophy of art, education and creativity. Michael Newall is a program leader in art and philosophy at the University of Kent, and I'm very happy that he joins me now. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Thank you very much, Pierre.
Michael, I went to art school, so I'm afraid I have some questions. But before we get into those, I'd like to ask you a little bit about your experience, how it is that you came to write a book about the art school, how you came to write a book about the philosophy of the art school. What was your intellectual and research trajectory? How did you get here?
Yeah, so I wouldn't have written this book unless I'd been to art school myself. And now I write about art and write philosophy of art, philosophy of perception, among other things, some art history. But I started off wanting to be an artist, and when I came out of school, so like a lot of people feel that way, of course, I signed up for art school. And I had particular perceptions of what it would be like. I thought that I would be learning certain skills. I'd be learning how to draw and how to paint, how to produce kind of lifelike images, all those kinds of things. Because I guess I'd seen films and movies about artists, and I'd been to art galleries. And I guess this was at a time, the early 90s, where actually contemporary art didn't have quite the profile it does now in terms of museums and the media. And so, I thought it was going to be portraits and landscapes and so on. When I got to art school, it was really, a surprise and a shock to me, like I think it probably was to, most people who turned up to art school then. And I spent a lot of time kind of waiting around for the proper art school to begin. And we got various different sorts of things. We learned little tiny bits of technique in the first year, but not enough to actually really master any skills, not enough to produce anything, that could hang in a museum. And we learnt things like colour theory, which involved colouring in little squares, like little abstract paintings, and colour circles and things. I actually managed to fail that. I produced a terrible colour circle. It was an embarrassment. And
I hope that exists in an archive somewhere. We can include this maybe as a link in the show notes.
That would be lovely.
For listeners to revisit.
Of course, we studied what I thought would be. We studied art theory, which is not art history at all. We didn't get to learn about art from, the Renaissance or whatever through to the 19th century and modernism. Rather, it was this other stuff, art theory, which was a whole range of stuff which involved aspects of different kinds of disciplines drawn in and applied to contemporary visual culture and the visual arts, critical theory, psychoanalysis, general postmodernism, all kinds of things.
Are we allowed to know which art school that was? I ask not because I want you to incriminate yourself, but I am at some point going to have to declare my various allegiances and experiences.
Yeah,
it might be interesting to compare some of our experiences and some of the time frames in which we got to observe these things.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear about your experiences too. So I went to a School of Art in where I grew up in Adelaide in South Australia, where I am now, in fact. It's an institution called the South Australian School of Arts, and it's over 150 years old. It's older than many well-known, even famous British art schools. But a really crucial thing that I've got to stress is that probably anyone who's been to an art school in Britain or America or Australasia, some other places too, they're very similar. The experiences are very similar. And there are kind of cultural reasons for that, because certainly in Australia, the staff as well as the curriculum for many years came from these other places. They come from, the cultural centres, Britain predominantly in the case of Australia.
Well, I think this issue of repetition and this kind of copycat nature of art school curricula and teaching methods is going to be quite interesting. But before we get back to that, I want to ask you maybe for a very simple definition of what it is that we are looking to teach, at the risk of asking a very banal question. What is the contemporary art of the contemporary art school?
No, it's a really important question because it's key to being taught. The contemporary art school, as you say, it teaches contemporary art, and that's the kind of art which you see in, for instance, contemporary art museums, which developed, it has its own kind of history, which got going from the 1960s onward. That's the kind of work which exemplifies the languages and concerns of contemporary art. And of course, they've grown and shifted since that time. One crucial feature is that contemporary art can look like anything. It can be made from any sort of medium. It could be film or video. It might be painting, might even be realistic painting or drawing. But it might be performance or some kind of assemblage of found objects or something else. There are simply no limits on what it can be. So it's very open in terms of its forms and techniques and materials, as open as anything can be. In terms of its content, there's a similar openness. It can really be about any kind of theme or topic that's of interest to art and to an arts community and to artists.
You're kind of setting yourself for quite a Sisyphean task here. I don't quite know where we can go from here because the central question of your book is, can art be taught? And we've just said that art can be
Yeah.
anything, but then the challenge is
Mm.
how the everything and anything can be taught. I wonder, before we get into this, I could ask you to join me in a little wordplay. If you have a copy of your book, if you would turn to page 3, I wonder if we could together read out a few answers to
Okay.
that very same question, which was posed by the artist John Reardon as he was interviewing a number of artists.
John Reardon's book is he has this fantastic book of interviews, and it's an amazing resource, which I highly recommend. I found it very useful.
Useful, it is also quite funny. So I'll ask the question, can art be taught?
Yeah, Phila de Barlow, she says, no, you cannot, but you can provide an endless process of inquiry and debate and discussion around it.
Graham Crowley responds, I'm going to get straight to it and ask what you mean by art.
This is a really direct one. Van Allen Green says, sure you can. You're teaching people how to think.
Right, another slightly longer involved answer. Can I teach art? Generally, I would say no, I can't teach art. I can only teach students to make their own work. I can't teach art because the definition of art is so wide and complex. I don't know how many artists there are in the world, perhaps 20 million? So we have 20 million definitions of art. That's a slightly obfuscating, I'd say, not particularly useful answer from Martin Hornet. Let's end with Christoph Schlesinghoff. 9. I have no idea how it works.
Yeah,
Right.
I think that's a really charming one. Yeah.
It's a charming one, and there would have been an amazing one if you've decided it was worth going with, because it would have saved you the effort of writing the book, I guess. But I'm guessing from the fact that I hold another 200 odd pages of the book in my hand is that you disagreed. How is it that we can answer this question, and how can we think about teaching art and what it means?
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing that I take from those quotes, and a lot of other things too, is there's no clear intuition about how to answer that question, at least in simple terms, whether it can be taught. And so part of the book, a large part of the book, the core of it, is trying to pick away the issues involved. And I see that there are immediately two issues that can be picked apart here, and they help explain why people who really know their stuff can give such very different answers and in such an authoritative mood. And I think, largely if you put them all in a room, I don't think they'd find a lot to disagree on. Really, part of the issue is that that they understand the question in different ways. So I think that's part of its complexity. I'll say there are two broad issues. One is a question about what teaching actually involves. And one is a question about what art actually involves. So if you understand teaching in a certain way, if you understand teaching as just a transferring of knowledge from teacher to student, then it's going to be hard to see how that's going to be something that will turn someone into an artist. If you understand teaching in another way, you can open up that possibility more easily, I think. So if you understand teaching on constructivist principles, you then understand it as teaching students to the skills, if you like, and attitudes they need to construct knowledge themselves, to go out there, learn things themselves. That's a particular way of thinking. Those two approaches to education, they're really kind of caricatures. No educational philosopher will say it's just this way or it's just that way, although perhaps some have in the past. One of those, the second one, if you like, where you're developing aptitudes to construct knowledge yourself, that's obviously going to be more useful in contemporary art. But there's also an understanding of art, what it is to be an artist, that's important. And I think at the core of understanding of what it is to be an artist is a term it's one that's come in and out of fashion. But the one core of being an artist is coming up with new things, new, valuable, original things. And that's creativity. It's, as I say, it's not always a fashionable term, but it's hard to come up with another word for it. It's the word that's used in educational theory and philosophy. The thing about creativity is that's what is really, if you analyse what it is that you need to be an artist, that's perhaps the only thing you can't really convey as knowledge. Everything else is about learning, say, the skills to manipulate a medium in a certain way, to understand theory in a certain way, facts about art history, almost everything, if you like, aside from this core kernel of creativity, can be conveyed as knowledge. It's the creativity, the capacity to actually generate new, interesting instances of art that haven't been seen before that are going to...
This is the super interesting thread that runs through the book. You convincingly answer your first question of can art be taught by proposing that the way one would go about this is to propose some kind of a concept of art being developed and instilled with the artist, and then one would follow on with developing skills and tools for exploring and expanding on that concept. And that's kind of all well and good. I can imagine how that could be framed in just about any educational style really possible. But there was a number of reasons by which we're not really in such an arbitrary territory as it comes to art. And I think that's where your research, your writing becomes particularly valuable, because the art school has undergone on one side absolutely zero development for 200 years, but also one revolution after another. Nonetheless, the central question remains exactly the same. So I'd like to ask you to maybe highlight some of the things that we might observe in the art school as they differ from other educational experiences.
Yeah, some striking features of the art school I fasten on to help motivate my account, and that, seem kind of mysterious just on their own. So one is what's sometimes called deskilling, and I use that term, coined by the Australian, I think, conceptual artist Ian Byrne. And I use it in this sense, I guess slightly different from his, is that in art school, one learns all kinds of skills, little bits and pieces, but you don't necessarily learn anything in particular. There aren't any fundamentals or essentials that you need to learn. And in some cases, certainly in some historical instances that I looked at in the 1960s, where there's this huge revolution, one of many in art school teaching, when it happens, there are art schools. I'm thinking of Leeds College of Art in particular, which was a really crucial example. There was almost nothing on the curriculum at all. So where in previous years there would have been many sequences of different things you had to learn around different media and different techniques and skills to be able to sculpt like Henry Moore, who worked there at one point, or draw and paint like a 19th century painter. All that stuff was completely removed. So there was nothing in particular you had to do apart from maybe a first introductory kind of exercise, a sort of a welcoming exercise more than learning any skills. You just made the work that you were interested in.
I mean, that almost sounds like the final work as well. It's the same assignment at every level, presumably.
So this is something that has changed because, can you imagine what the sort of curriculum documents that you have to produce now would have looked like in, under such circumstances? And I think it's changed with good reason too, because you need a kind of a scaffolding before you're given complete freedom. There was also a historical aspect to this. This happened to lesser degrees at many art schools, and a whole generation of artists went without learning these traditional skills. And it meant by the time that I went to art school in the 90s, the people I was taught by, who went to art school in the 60s or 70s, roughly speaking, on the whole, roughly speaking, they hadn't got the kind of training that I was expecting. They weren't able to teach me this. It wasn't as if they were withholding it.
But something, of course, replaces this lost material.
That deskilling is one thing. Another thing is the introduction of art theory. People are sometimes astonished by the way, if you don't know art schools and the art world, they can be astonished by the way that artists are not so much talk usually, but write about their work. It seems to be a kind of a language in its own right. That's something that has an interesting history to it. And that language has a kind of function, a really important function as well, in framing artists' concerns, first for themselves, second for, the immediate communities they're part of, and third, actually, it starts to feed into the way that contemporary art museums communicate to the broader culture. So it's strange, sort of awkward language because it's this combination of all kinds of things, as I said, critical theory, psychoanalysis, art history. So to a specialist in any of these areas, it will seem strange and disjointed. That's something that has grown up by a kind of process. So what happened in the 1950s, when art school training was somewhat different, it was in many progressive schools, it was dominated by modernism, so think especially abstract painting. Their art history in Britain, which is very influential, the first model that developed for teaching, like art theory, wasn't really art theory at all. It was art history. There was a very simple approach. In your first year at art school, you would learn the first centuries of art history from, let's say, the Stone Age with scare quotes, through to, let's say, the Renaissance. In the second year, you might learn the 19th century, and in your final year, you'd get to learn modern art, and that'd kind of be it. This is something I don't mention in the book, but the art historian, great feminist art historian Griselda Pollock, I asked her about her experiences teaching, and little known factor because she knows a lot about art schools and art school training. But she started off teaching theory in art schools. I met her where I was teaching at the time in Canterbury at the University of Kent, and it turned out that she had taught in Kent at an institution that's changed its name. It's now part of the University of the Creative Arts. She said that the students, after a while of these classes, getting the complete history of art in slow motion over 3 years, the students bailed her up. So this would have been into the 1960s, I suppose, perhaps the early 70s. And she said the students bailed her up and said, "This is just completely irrelevant to us. We hate it. Stop it. We want to know about what's going on now and contemporary art and the issues around contemporary culture and all these things, which, of course, she completely knew about." And she said, she listened to them and she just pivoted on the spot and gave them these things that they wanted and which they needed. And that's something that in different forms, many teachers, obviously not as accommodating as Griselda Pollock, but sooner or later, that art history gave way to the art theory as people in art schools know it and, sometimes love it.
Yeah, we're getting a bit controversial here already, but I mean, what you mentioned
Perhaps,
now, the idea of students making demands on the teachers is something that comes up throughout the book and through the history of the art school, and I think that's something that happens quite a lot earlier than we might imagine. It's not just the idea of the 1960s in which various types of social revolutions pile up onto each other. And one of the things I want us to get to later on in the conversation is how we can imagine, how we can conceive the students' desires as they keep on changing and the demands of the university, which is now the natural home, or rather the de facto home for the art school. But maybe I could ask you to persevere with kind of historical overview. Essentially start us off in the 18th, 19th century, a little bit in France, a little bit in Germany, with different aims. And I think if we could have a whirlwind tour through the histories and the features of these developments, I think it might help us untangle where we are today.
Yeah, I think so. So I start off, as you say, in around the 18th century, which is a kind of a high watermark for academy teaching. It's the 17th, 18th century. That's the kind of traditional art school training that many people imagine. Students would learn how to first. In fact, they would learn how to do something which I think most students would really be horrified now, how to copy. You would copy drawings, prints, and sculptures, and you'd spend an enormously long time doing that. And once you're able to draw well, you'd get to paint, which might take quite some time. And it might only be a few years in that you'd get to do the most exciting thing for artists at the time, many artists at the time, which is work from the life model, the nude model, which is a kind of basic building block for what back then was the most ambitious form of painting, history paintings, look like a Poussin or a Raphael or a Michelangelo, this sort of thing. And that's a kind of training that actually in many places continued up until even the 1950s, relatively unchanged in many places. And you can still see, if you go into the old art schools in Europe and other places too now. So the Royal Academy in London is a great example. They've still got all their plaster casts up. So they're plaster casts of famous sculptures. Obviously, the students don't use these things at all.
Well, they have become tourist attractions now after the Royal Academy has been remodeled.
Yeah, and they are actually fabulous things, and they still have the life drawing room, which is purpose built, which is a wonderful thing. I say these things, and many art schools will say, no, we still do that. But of course, it'll just be a few little introductory things.
We will have to figure out a way of interrogating the connections. Tracey
Mm,
Emin, our Royal Academician, one of the generation of
mm,
young British artists who came to prominence in the 90s and the early 2000s,
mm.
she quite famously says that she would really recommend students, aspiring artists, to go and spend some time doing life drawing. She propagates, she
Mm.
really promotes the idea of connecting the eye and the hand, the pencil still being tool. And it's very, very bizarre to hear that kind of endorsement of life drawing as a skill
Yeah.
development, as a toolkit.
Emin is really interesting. She is someone who is very open about the positive influence that art school had for her, and you can see that
Mm,
in her work. And she's known as this exemplar of a transgressive artist. That all came out of an art school background, and she's someone who's really open about that. And that's actually a really unusual thing. I think that speaks to
mm,
her confidence. Most artists, like all of us, they draw from their context, things they've learned.
yeah.
But most artists tend to kind of diminish that. They don't talk about the schools and the people who are really influential on them.
Mm. So you mentioned a useful word, which is the artist as an exemplar. The artist as exemplar is a phrase that appears in the book, and I wonder whether we could use this to go back to the historical view
Yeah.
and talk about maybe the role of the masterclass and how it develops historically.
Yeah. So what happens in the 18th century, which is really an important development for contemporary art, is that there was this revolt against the academy, against academic
Mm,
models of, and you can think of it in particular as the sequential learning of skills
yeah.
and dutiful obedience to a master, and really crucial thing, copying. In the 18th century, and it's something that continued to develop in the 19th, there was this then somewhat new notion of the artist as a genius, the romantic genius. This quickly, as soon as it developed, it also became a kind of cliche, which people were aware of. But it's something that's utterly changed the culture for ambitious artists. Instead
Yeah.
of wanting to get your head down and perform well in the academy, you we're instead supposed to do what it is that a genius does. And a genius is somebody who is, to use the modern term, they're creative, let's say radically, hugely creative. They're someone who comes up with new inventions, new ideas, original things no one's ever seen before in the world. And that's what a great artist is now supposed to
Mm,
do. And if you think about it that way, if you think about the achievements of a really significant artist that way, the only way they're going to do that is to reject imitation of
yeah.
other forms. That is to say, to reject the models of the academy. Partly tied up with that, there's a development of what, in a way, is a new way of teaching, but it's also a very old way of teaching. I call it the masterclass, which is,
Mm,
if you like, the German term. It's also known as atelier teaching, so the French term, French for the artist studio. And the idea is that instead of going to copying these great classical models, you would go to an artist who is a great genius and will be a model in some sense for your own
mhm.
genius, who is an exemplary figure. There's a little puzzle about how this is going to work here. Because if the student of this great artist who's a genius is going to make original work, they can't simply copy their master's work,
Yeah.
can they? Because that won't be original. Also, artists at the time had to sort of think about how this would work. And, there are different ways of putting it. But, one sort of romantic idea, this is a way that Edward Young, who's a really important poet, really important theorist for early Romanticism, puts it, is that the young artist will kind of spark off the fire
Mm,
of their master, the genius. Another way, which we might put it now, is that they use their master as a model, and they don't copy the works of the master. Though of course they might, and critics might say, well, you're not original. You're just copying the
Yeah,
works of someone who is original. But one idea, a positive slant to put on it, is that you can learn how to be an artist, perhaps what the techniques of originality are. Then you can apply those techniques yourself
yeah,
and develop your own original approach. Whatever way you see it, though, there was this huge desire among ambitious young artists to go and train with the leading artists of their age, and so those artists, people like David, who hated the academy for his own reasons.
mm,
This is end of the 18th century in France, opened up his studio. And essentially, because he was such an important, influential, famous artist, his studio essentially became another kind of academy. And this happened with other artists on the continent in particular.
yeah.
And it's something that from the early 19th century was accommodated, or in a German model, it was integrated into academic teaching. So what would happen is you'd have the ordinary academic curriculum, and then in your final years, you'd get to choose an artist to work with, which would
Yeah, and
be
it,
part of the
as you
art
know, this
school.
system prevails in Germany in particular, and quite bizarrely, in
Mm,
my experience, German art school seems to be completely filled with either British or American artists, or in overseas artists
yeah.
living in Berlin and commuting. So it's kind of strange to see how often the kind of masterclass idea that the art schools
Yeah.
trade off has become internationalized. I laughed a little bit earlier when when you first mentioned the idea of the artistic genius. Listeners who've heard me
Mm,
talking about these ideas before will know that I believe that the artistic genius is about the worst thing that has happened in art history, and I don't think we have expunged it
really? Yeah.
from our
Yeah.
practices. But that's a very long conversation, and I want to come
Yeah.
back to this in particular because one of the things that you do at various points of the book, which really strikes into the central question of what role originality and
Mm,
creativity, how these two are linked, how these things are performed or performable within the various types of art teaching. And when you come to genius in
mm,
the masterclass, it's the first time you invoke Kantian ideas of
mm.
originality. So I guess this is as good a moment as any for you to disagree with Immanuel Kant.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
I mean, just, no biggie.
Yeah. No, there's obviously there's scope for that. He's someone who wrote about genius and took the idea seriously. But Kantians, I mean, there is a cottage industry of Kantian philosophers, and they will have
Well,
their
it's
own.
the
They'll have
Kantian
their own.
industrial complex, Michael.
Nicely put. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Kant, he was thinking about this stuff at the end of the 18th century, and he drew on prevailing ideas that were out there,
Mm.
this relatively new conception of the romantic genius. I mean, one really crucial thing, I really agree that genius is something it's overrated, in a word. Perhaps it's even an imaginary thing.
Mm.
Depends how you put it and how you describe it. Something that has been, in a way, it overlaps with creativity. In another way, it's opposed to creativity. For Kant, genius involves the generation of original ideas. That's the way he puts it. Ideas
Mm.
that are new to the world. And you can understand creativity, at least a strong form of creativity, in the same way. And so there's an overlap. It's a straightforward overlap, talking about the same thing. But in another sense, they're really not talking about the same thing, because for one reason, not the only reason, for Kant, genius is a rare, elite, special thing. And it's something which only a handful of people are going to have. And there are lots of other people who say this. There are Young says this, something that Ruskin goes on about later in the 19th century. It's a really select group, and most people are going to fall far short. Those
Yeah.
who fall far short, they're doomed to just imitate the genius. It's something that has much older roots, but in the mid 20th century, and there have been reactions against this too, as you'd expect, a much more democratic idea of creativity developed and became really powerful, especially in education. And that sees creativity as not elitist, but democratic, that we all have
Yeah.
really, in an important sense, a capacity for creativity. You could immediately say, well, sure, everyone is creative, every child is creative, and so on. We all have that capacity. And the other crucial thing here is that to fully realize yourself as a human being, you should, in some way, not necessarily through art, fulfill that capacity for creativity. Otherwise, you haven't truly, lived your life,
Mm.
if you like, lived your best life. I think there is also, there is something to that idea. I mean, that idea, that very democratic notion of creativity, it's a bit different from what you might think we're talking about with, let's say, call it Kantian genius. That kind of creativity that we all have, you might say, well, it's not everyone necessarily is going to have the capacity to come up with new things that no one's ever thought of before. So perhaps there's a higher bar you want to set. But I think the bar for that is a lot lower than Kant actually sets it. I think that most of us, if we really work at a particular discipline and have a love for it, passion for it, and are given the opportunity to develop our own ideas, there often is a scope to develop new approaches, to develop new insights, to perhaps deepen our knowledge or understanding from a certain perspective. And that's especially the case when we all have different perspectives and come from different contexts. And I also think it's not impossibly hard to realize, as Kant thought as well. Something to be added here. Every art student, every ambitious art students in the 19th century and late 18th century in Europe, they all thought they were geniuses. Every one of them, they thought they were, the chosen one, and that's really clear too. That's why they were going off to learn in masterclass or classes or ateliers. So in a sense, maybe not that much has changed. But yeah, I am much more in favour to give it a slogan. I see creativity as a much more democratic, accessible, potentially accessible quality attribute.
Well, I guess that's just as well. Otherwise, we would risk going back to the very beginning of the book and asking the fundamental question of whether art can be taught yet again, and possibly answering in the negative. But I want us to skip now as fast as we can to the 20th century and talk about the development of the crit, which is yet another kind of strange invention as it goes in the canon of higher education.
The crit is a really distinctive feature of the contemporary art school. It's something which is very different from most other forms of teaching. What happens usually is a student will bring in something they've been working on. It could be anything. It might be a painting or a sculpture or an assemblage or a video work. They might give a performance, a reading, but usually it'll be an object, and the object sits there in the center of the room, and a group of students and will sit around this object and they will look at it. Usually, not always, the student will be asked to say something to introduce it, to explain how they came to make this. And then the group will talk. There'll be a conversation with the students among the group members. And it's often very, if you like, level. In some schools, especially in Britain, the students will often talk among themselves as much
Mm,
or more than the teachers will about their own responses. And in other places, perhaps more often in America, you'll have a number of staff members and they'll much more take the lead.
yeah.
Um, but whatever happens, it's entirely free in the kind of discussion that might occur. Anything might happen. You're allowed to certainly since the 1960s, one's been allowed, or 70s, when these approaches developed, one's been allowed to say simply anything. So one thing that's really striking about this is that it can be, certainly it has in the past. I mean, I think it's changed under certain pressures recently, but it could be an extremely hostile environment. Almost
Mm.
everyone that I talked to spoke about how tears could flow in a crit. So students would regularly be reduced to tears. And I think it has to be said that in most of the descriptions I've seen, those students are women. That's
Mm.
not to say that men don't get it just as often, get it just as hard as well. I think the answer that most teachers would give now is that crits may have had those failings in the past, partly because of their structure, partly because of attitudes of the staff, but that new models have addressed those issues. And I think that's a really interesting thing as well, that people just haven't looked at.
So the crit being probably the one identifiable common element across pretty
Mm,
much every single UK art school, whatever it is they're trying to do. It's no surprise that we will see this students educating each other kind of model favored by the art school. But what I'm interested in, having observed art schools as an occasional visiting lecturer, I'm seeing actually a very different set of attitudes. So while I completely agree that
mm,
sexism, racism, and pretty much every other form of discrimination might have been the default mode of interaction in the 1970s, 80s, or even
mm,
90s, actually, I see quite a lot of interest in trigger warning conversation, like safe spaces. Maybe I'm a little bit old and I find
mm,
this a little bit funny to a certain extent, but that completely aside, I do wonder what that possibly means in terms of what the crit can do as an educational device, what that means in terms of the independence of thought that the crit can
mm.
produce. And I think in your terms, that's something I know you have been thinking about since you wrote the book. It's the idea of consensus.
The account I give, looking at the experiences of people I knew, what I'd read about crits, what I'd found out about the history of crits, which is really limited. Someone should write a history of this form of education. The remarkable thing is it's just not clear what they're supposed to do and what can be done in this remarkably free environment where apparently anything goes. The student presents anything, and people respond in any way that they like. What can possibly be gained, learned in such an environment? So that's to put the question in the strongest way possible. You might say, well, maybe it's not much, so what? The problem with that is, well, this is, as the point Elkins has made, this is how art is taught, that this is the
Yeah.
interaction between students and staff. So if the teacher's going to happen anywhere, it's got to happen here. It's pretty much the only place. Sure, there's theory, but that's a kind of a side dish to the practical art education. So I thought, well, if crit works well, what is it doing? And this is the account that I came up with. And I have to say, often crits don't work well, and I spend a lot of time looking at that and look at interesting examples, interesting, horrifying examples where people really suffer, from horrible abuse at the hands of staff. And perhaps it also needs to be said, it's clear that art schools, they do teach things to many students. They clearly value the experience very highly. And if you do want to be a successful artist, you pretty much have to go to art school. You need to go to an art school to learn how to be an artist. And if you look at the CVs of successful artists, and this is the case going back probably roughly speaking a good 50 years, there are exceptions. Absolutely, there are exceptions, but pretty much everyone has gone to art school. And if they haven't gone to art school, they've usually studied a cognate discipline. That's all to say, crits, they seem to me to need attention. They seem to me to need a positive account of what is drawn from them. I thought this was best understood in terms of consensus, which I have to say is a Kantian term. It's a really problematic term, which I've become more and more doubtful about, and I'll say something about that too. But the idea was that if you're going to derive anything of value from a crit, one has to, as a student going into it, you have to draw something from the response of your audience. And my thinking was that once you've tried your ideas as a student out on the audience tries each other's ideas out on them and you as well, that there's going to be some area of consensus. So idiosyncratic outlying ideas can be dismissed, put aside, but more often than not, there's going to be some kind of general overlap in the value that people can find in a work, or the feelings people have about it, or the sort of suggestions they might have for further directions one might explore. I felt that I found a lot of evidence that suggested that when people spent time with crits and when they worked well, when they focused on them and they were run in a good way, this is something that would occur. And the idea was that the consensus would be a kind of democratic thing. It could come, it would have to come more from the students, certainly in a British context, than the staff, because there are more students there, who are responding. And there's also an implication there that staff shouldn't surreptitiously lead students in a particular way, which absolutely happens. It happens a lot. That's something which I've become more doubtful about since writing the book. The things that have made me doubtful: first, Me Too, and second, Black Lives Matter, and all the changing focus around art and culture that's come out of that. Those things make me less, if you like, less of a believer in consensus. I think if you have a relatively homogenous group, consensus is quite easy. If you have diversity, the more diversity you have, the harder that kind of consensus is going to get. And I think that's something which, both in practice and in theory, can only make crits a tougher kind of thing. What is at risk of happening, what could very easily happen. And I think what happened in the past is students talked about their own experiences and brought symbols of their own experience into their work. And these were dismissed by, if you like, the consensus of the dominant culture. I think there's still scope to explore the possibility for shared responses, and that's really important. But I think there's less scope than perhaps what I suggest in the book. And I think there's a real risk of manufacturing consensus, if you like, and that's a really dangerous thing. But I also think that the people who've been teaching crits, the pandemic has really changed crits. It would have been an astonishing thing to anyone 2 years ago. They've been conducted online now, and at many places, you can't be hostile over Zoom, or people will just turn off. And so I think the crits it's going through changes. It's a relatively young form. It started off, so far as I can figure out, in Britain in the 1960s under the name group criticism, established in art schools properly in a widespread way, certainly in Britain and Australia in the 1970s. So it's a relatively new form of teaching.
So a couple of things come to mind as you're talking about the problems of the critters. One is the lack of any precision in the curriculum, the course handbook. And we wouldn't be surprised that even as diverse as art schools are, and just as a couple of names out of the hat, I can't think of two places more radically different in what kind of artist and for what reason they produce than, say, Goldsmiths in London and the Royal College of Art also in London. They have very different ideas of what art is. But my guess, looking at the curriculum and at the course handbook, they're probably very, very thin. They tell you what you'll be able to do, what aspirations you might be able to pursue at the end of your degree, but they won't necessarily tell you what you'll learn. And the second thing that comes at the end of that is that students universally find the idea of assessment utterly, utterly confusing. They don't know what's being said to them by who. I mean, this is particularly prevalent at undergraduate level for obvious reasons. That's actually a really fundamental confusion in what the art school tries to do. And yet, as we have observed time and time again, it exists, it propagates.
Yeah.
So how do
Yeah.
you account for these features?
Yeah, I think these are really interesting issues, and there are lots of issues tied up with them. And one issue is that the romantic ethos, the artist as romantic
Oh, the
genius,
romantic genius
it's
comes back
yeah,
again. I told
it
you.
it really does. Yeah, it maintains a certain life here because students, it's something which they absorb before they come to art school
Hmm.
from the broader culture. And there's a sense that many of them feel, understandably on that basis, that there should not be some kind of rule applied to them. There shouldn't be criteria that they're satisfying in a way that obviously if they were doing, I don't know, maths or accounting or the sciences or
Hmm.
whatever. The issue is if you come with that kind of thought, the question is, well, why are you at art school? There's a sense that whatever they should do should be, it ought to be kind of congratulated. And that's something, I should say I'm really positive about students and very much on their side. And I take their side against that of academics and teachers again and again throughout the book. But this is something which, it's a trace of an older culture, this idea of
Yeah.
the romantic genius. And it's something that in outside, in schools, in many art classes, people will, certain teachers, they're raised also influenced by this tradition. You'll be praised for what you do. You turn up at art school and, you're no longer praised for anything you do. And it's really confusing. And you think, well, it's come out of me. It must have some value. That question of explaining what it is, what the point of art school is, and one way is to say, well, what do you expect to get out of art school aside from a studio space? And there has to be some kind of answer to that question because clearly some students they'll stick to that approach throughout and ignore their teachers, and those attitudes have been shaped by these older
Hmm.
19th century attitudes. I really wanted to have an answer to, an answer that teachers could give, that I could give to people who said, well, what should I be? What are the criteria for assessment here? And I think, one way of saying it, if one does think about consensus, and I think, as I say, you have to think about that in a provisional way, is that consensus arises out of a community. The art school is a community, if you like, of makers. And I really want to
Hmm.
think of the students as much, even more than the staff. And so it's that community that needs to provide a standard of judgment, because that's what one really needs, some kind of standard of judgment. Say, you should stop doing all this romantic stuff, and you should think about where it's come from and all these things. That's got to come from the community, if you like, and it would do well. It'd be, in some cases, be a better thing if that message could be made clearer. But it's also these issues interact with other things. So art school teachers have sort of just assumed that it would all, that the smart kids work these things out,
Hmm.
and they read all these social cues well. And that's one thing that you need to often to be successful at art school, to pick these things up. I think some of that could be made clearer. You say that quite rightly that if you look at what all these schools say they're teaching, Goldsmiths or the Royal Academy, I should say I haven't looked at those explicitly, but they're just the same everywhere. They're often kind of, all the documents that are produced now, they're very similar. That hasn't come organically out of art schools. That's come from universities. Someone said, we need
Yeah.
criteria for assessments. What are they? And then the teachers go, we have to come up with something, and they do, and then they, copy it, and at every college and university across Britain, and spreads, develops, and so on. So there's this culture of, if you like, documents that is not entirely related to what goes on in practice.
Michael, I have one more question, which maybe will involve a bit more speculation. And let's assume that we have finished humming along to Common People by Pulp for this
Okay.
part of the
Yeah.
conversation. The sculpture at St. Martin's College and the romantic
Mm.
genius is gone. So one of the things that I see that you had been trying to do in the book is to look at ways of rehabilitating some of the historical developments that have been so particularly useful to the success of certain types of art schools. But I'd like us to take a second to, at the end, situate some of your proposals, which are to do with the masterclass and the crit, the role of theory, your proposals for placing technical type of instructions in a particular sequence. I want us to consider this a little bit in light of the fact that art education has, over the last 10 years, become about as diverse as the range of instrumental aims of institutionally and commercially supported art practices has been. But there's also a preponderance of courses that are trying to produce artistic training or produce artists purely
Mm.
for their transferable skills. There's so many art schools around the world, around the UK alone, that produce artists who will
Mm.
never be artists. Therefore, we are kind of banking that they will have skills they can take elsewhere. There's
Mm.
a range of really specialized courses like art for social change, art for therapy. And some of
Mm.
these have very clear curricula where you would understand what the extensions are. But in my look at particularly art and social practice, art and politics courses, they're about as vague with the curricula as mainstream art schools. They just tell that, they have fine art written above the door. Long question, big problem.
Mm.
How do we deal with this?
Yeah, you could say, well, what are art schools? What are art schools for? The obvious answer, is training artists. But there aren't like a lot of job openings for artists anywhere in the world.
Yeah, Martin Holland claimed we had 20 million artists in the world. I mean, he is wrong, but not that wrong.
Yeah, so there are anxieties people have about what are we training all these people for? It's absolutely true that art schools on the whole, certainly for the last 50 odd years, it's where artists, professional artists have come from.
Mm.
The more I thought about creativity and looked into it, wrote about it, thought about what happens in art schools, and the more that I talked with people who've come out of art schools about their experiences, the more I felt that it was something that was valuable in itself, number one. And number two, has substantial transferable value, not always the transferable value that people want or expect, economically. But I've already touched on the idea that living a creative life is part of what we need to do to fulfill ourselves. Say you're someone who goes to art school and then does not become an artist, immediately drops it. You've spent 3 years of your life, maybe more, exploring, realizing your creativity, realizing yourself as a creative individual. I think that's got value in itself. I think it really needs to be connected with life more broadly. I can see on my video your brows moving, micro expressions of concern and doubt. Uh, so let me follow that up by saying, I've also seen people who come out of art school, that experience of art school, they're swept away by it, and a few years later, they feel quite lost. They don't know what they're meant to do. They need to find something else to do. And I also see, and this is, something that can be slightly painful thing. Sometimes people who do devote their lives to art, the economic situation, it can be really difficult for them. It would have been much easier if they'd done accounting, something like that. But I also see a lot of people, and I'm one of them, who I'm not an artist, but I've gone on to putting aside this particular work on art schools, which is just one part of what I do. I've gone on to teach in cognate disciplines, write different kinds of writing, and be involved with art and visual culture in different ways. But there are, there's real complexity there, because if you look at the history in the 1960s, when this kind of art school training began, it was a tiny percentage of people in Britain, in Australia too, who went onto higher education, went to do these new kinds of fine art programs. And that's something that's really changed and grown, and it's produced a lot more of, a lot more fine arts graduates, and that's made these problems of these challenges tougher. And it's also made the question of what the curriculum of the art school should be like tougher as well, perhaps more interesting. I'm optimistic about it. That's what I would want my final word to be on that. I really think it's a valuable thing to do, to go to art school, and I think there's a lot of good that comes at the level of the individual and the community from it, not just in an artistic culture, but in the culture generally.
Well, hooray to that, Michael. I mean, I have to clarify that even though I have been complaining about the article in my critical questions, I am still happy that I did go go to one myself. So thank you so much, Michael, for your research and for the conversation and for your optimism.
Yeah, well, thank you, Pierre. It's been a real pleasure.
A Philosophy of the Art School by Michael Newall is published by Routledge. I'm Pierre, and the editor is Marshall Poe. Thank you for listening, and join us next time.